The events of 9/11 have popularized all over the world the term jihad, for those who didn't know it then. And the events of January, February 2011, to begin with in Egypt, Tunisia, Egypt, and all the rest, has diffused a new term, I think, unbeknownst to most Western audiences, which is Sharia. And if I were to define Sharia in a kind of a lighter vein, there is one which I like very much by a famous Egyptian jurist who says that Sharia, contrary to what you may imagine, is actually a giraffe. And what he meant is the famous Egyptian story, to which there are Jewish analogues, of the felah who goes for the first time to the zoo in Cairo, sees a giraffe and says, there is no such animal. And yes, there is, of course. So the thing about Sharia is that there is both a concept which is rather enigmatic, an enigma encapsulated within a puzzle and orchestrated by a mystique which has nothing to do with realities. And yet there are people going into revolt in 2011 and fighting for at least 40, 50 years under dire situations of dictatorship in the name of application of Sharia. Or somebody, we don't know who he was, who invented this slogan. It's a very good PR man. Sharia is the solution. Not Nasserism, not Arabism, not communism. Sharia is the solution. It's something which stuck. And even their enemies and rivals have to fight and at least make believe like they believe in that Sharia is a solution, but their Sharia is, of course, different, more liberal, more open, etc. So there is a paradox here. And actually, Sharia does not exist. This felah who goes to the Cairo Zoo was right. Sharia is a very vague term defining Islamic law. And Islam, as you know, like Judaism, is a religion based upon shaping behavior. Naaseh v'nishma. Unlike Christianity, Islam got it from Judaism and very consciously got it from Judaism. People have to act first and then they discover the motivation and the deep reasoning, and ours is not to reason why. Ours is to do the precepts which He, the Almighty, has enjoined upon us, and from time to time some of us will understand more. Ultimately, some people perhaps get closer to it, but behavior is first. Sharia is not halacha. Although we usually translate it for the ignorant masses, as Maimonides called them, including the present audience, as halacha, it's not exactly halacha. Sharia is, like all metaphors coming from the desert, has to do something with life of the desert. It's the right way to the water. And you can imagine finding the right way to the fountain in the desert situation is a crucial thing. It's the right way of behavior for a believer in order to satisfy, or if you want to be more precise, to satisfice, to do as much as he can never do all, God's wishes for man's just behavior. Halacha is a much more specific term for which there is an Arab analog, and I'm not going to burden you with terms, which is called fiqh, for those who know it, which is mainly the body of the thinking and the decrees of those learned in the law, the ulema, which develop over the ages in order to give credence, to put flesh on the bones of God's wishes. Now, so much, quite easy. I mean, if we want to have an Islamic state, and if our wishes as Muslims is to live in a just Islamic society, so let's go look at the books and see what they enjoin upon us, see the differences from the reality in the society around us, and try as much as we can to close the gaps. But it's not so easy for a number of reasons. And this number of reasons will explain to you much of the hesitations, much of the peripeties of the present Islamic rebellions as they get to power. And they are, until now, in power only in two states, Tunisia and Egypt. They are sort of close to power in two states, actually in three states, which are failed states: Libya, Somalia, Yemen. So you don't really know if it means anything that they are close to power. Maybe they are close to power just in a little coin. And everything is up in the air in Syria, where my belief is that we are facing a long, fratricidal war, which may even spread elsewhere, to begin with, to Jordan. What is the problem? Assume, for example, that you have a real state, and we have just two states in which this question is really applicable. And in those two states, actually, there is a debate about constitution, which is very unruly, which is very deeply manipulated. It's not very clear that it will attain anything. In Tunisia, it's closer to closure of the game by perhaps next December. In Egypt, I think it will train and it will drag much, much longer. And what is the problem? To begin with, if we stick to the analogy with Judaism, there is no Shulchan Aruch. Nobody has ever done the intellectual feat of Rabbi Joseph Caro of trying to sum up in a magisterial and authoritative way to distill the essence of those decisions taken along the centuries. It's not that Arabs or Muslims lacked intellectual power. Of course they did have it. And there is even one of them who in the early days of the Abbasid Empire, his name was Malik ibn Anas, and he was the founder of one of the major schools, who even wrote a book which, for the times at least, we are speaking about late 8th century, is a good summing up of the debates and of the decisions which the majority of the ulama at the time, those are formative times of course, so everything is very crude, in a way, accepts. And interestingly enough, after he wrote the book, at the caliph of those times, who is the second Abbasid caliph, wanted to set it as the law of the land. And this was still a time when caliphate was central power. He could have employed it. The man himself who wrote the book as an intellectual exercise said, no, don't do it. Don't do it for two reasons. And shows to you a man of some acumen to understand the reason. One, we are still information. We are still half-baked. We are just 1 century and a bit more from the death of Prophet Muhammad. We are evolving. We are evolving into life of empire, something which Muhammad at least did not envision, or at least did not tell us that he envisions. We are ruling over the remains of two important empires of the time, the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire. We are still organizing things. maybe you don't understand all the subtleties. And two, and that's very important, he says, we are still debating and we should keep the debate going on. He gave an explanation, and he gave, interestingly enough, as an example, the Talmud. He says, look at the Jews. They write about how to debate, and they taught themselves how to debate. So all the more so, we who have power, who have coercion. Luckily for Islam, perhaps, the Caliph accepted, even though perhaps the instinct of a caliph in order to inform authority and uniformity would have been to take this book, which is called Al-Muwatta, and it's still around, and it's very important for the school of law which he created. He refrained from this. This was perhaps the moment when the Sharia was created into a giraffe. It created as a vague hope that together, by a debate between schools, this is still at a time when the empire was relatively coherent and uniform. By the 10th century, it will break down into more or less states of the size of those we know today. A process of debate within a scholarly community, but in interactions with the powers that be. Of course, we're very close, and of course the powers that be had great interest in what is being decided then, was created. The myth here, this is a myth in a sense of a story, a foundation story, and this is the second foundation story, is that by the, say, 9th, 10th century, the process was completed. And as the Muslims usually say, the gates of ijtihad, the gates of evolving thinking on the law was completed and was crystallized in 4 schools. All 4 schools are of equal value. The school, which happens today to be mostly predominant in North Africa, is one of them, but there are 3 others, never mind the name. And usually in every region of Islam, in later centuries, after the 10th century, one school got the upper hand, but that others existed, were tolerated, and people were given access to judges who judge according to them. You can't even say that there is a systematic difference between the schools, but there is variety. And this variety, in fact, enabled Islam to continue to develop well beyond the 10th century its lawmaking considerations. So, there are 2 myths here. Myth number 1 is that there was a moment where you could have imposed everything through caliphal power, late 8th century. And second, then, okay, so we continued the debate for 2 centuries, but then we stopped. Well, they did stop. And we know today, and by the way, the men mostly responsible for this discovery, the first who discovered this, about 40 years ago, is an Arab Israeli who teaches today at McGill in Canada, Wael Haddad, who really has succeeded to prove that the debate went on, and there were changes well before modernization has laid out new charges to Islam. So you have a variety and a changing of the debates and tendencies, and by the same time, you have a process of judicial process with which you are with which you are very much aware in your own work. And judges many times, even though they belong to one school, judged on certain matters according to another school. So we have actually something very fuzzy, huge variety of decisions, and very few things could be distilled as the essence. As they debate today in Egypt, the first important debate was around Article 2 of the Constitution, They are beginning with the Constitution of 1971, laid down by Sadat. And Article 2 says, among other things, that the state, which is an Arab state and of a Muslim character, will be managed, will be orchestrated according to the principles of the Sharia. Now, there are no principles of the Sharia because the Sharia does not exist. The Sharia is a process. The result are 4 books which were created in the 10th century, but even they evolved within the thinking of each school, and judges were not always held to the law as laid down by their own schools. So there was a lot of suppleness in the process, which enables you to understand how the Islamic world has achieved something which I think has not been achieved by other civilizations. And this is that all the areas conquered by the Muslims, say, usually they say around the year 711, the year they conquered Spain, all those areas from Central Asia to Gibraltar, excluding Spain, of course, and Sicily, which will be retaken by the West, are still Muslim. It's a feat you have to think about. They also spread later into Black Africa and into areas in the southeast, but they are still keeping this, and they kept this because of this superstructure, because of the fuzziness. So, number one, the whole term apply the Sharia, it's in everybody's eye. And intelligent people may go and debate this ad aeternum. Second, can you still distill from this huge fuzziness, and of course I'm speaking here just about Sunni Islam. Shiite Islam has got its own schools of law in rather the same process. The details are not important. Can you still distill certain governing lines, perhaps not laid down, perhaps seen half transparently within the process? Well, you can. And one of the first among them is the fact that Islamic law says almost nothing about what you will call, in your terms, constitutional law. How is government to be organized? One thing it says very clearly, nevertheless, this government is not going to be a democracy. Contrary to what all the apologists of democracy say, democracy is a novelty. But then democracy, of course, was a novelty in the West as well. It was invented in 17th century in England and the Netherlands, spread via the French Revolution, etc., and fought tooth and tail by the Catholic Church. In 1870, it was democracy was included in the index of forbidden thoughts, forbidden concepts, laid down by the First Vatican Council. And the Catholic Church, in a way, remained the enemy of democracy until the end of World War II. It's only in the Christmas message of 1945 that the then Pope, with whom the Jews have also certain debates, declared democracy to be the accepted notion of the Church, because he understood through the experience of World War II that the alternative is totalitarianism. And the totalitarianism actually, whether communist or Nazi, is the denial of any religion. So, if it took the West, the intelligent, developed West, more than 250 years to understand what democracy is about, it means that this is an innovation. It's not something natural. Most civilizations has lived through kinds of authoritarian regimes in the past. Whether you call it patriarchy or any other terms, totalitarianism is just a modern, industrialized, scientific organization of this authority. And this new idea that people are not subject, people are citizens, is a new idea. If you had been in France in 1790, would you have known that this is a revolution which happened last year? Would you have known that the declarations of the right of citizen, this curious invention of a whole century of enlightenment, of highfalutin individuals completely ignorant of realities, of the real cynical world in which we all live? It's not very clear that if it had been put to the vote in France at that time, it would have been accepted. It was done by a revolution, coercing the majority by a minority, a militant minority, which knew what was good for them, which knew what is virtue, the famous virtue, which Rousseau has invented as the guiding line. So it's no big novelty, perhaps, but it's worth repeating that, of course, Islam is like Judaism, undemocratic. The fact that, for example, in the Second Zionist Congress, you already had proportional representation and representation of women in 1898, well before any European nation has done it, was due above all to a fact which is a historical is of a historical value, but nothing deterministic about it. That most of the Jews active at that time were members of the democratic opposition in the Tsarist Empire, actually members of a certain party, the Cadet Party. And they introduced this idea, which goes against the vein of Judaism, in which you go to an authority, a rabbi, and a rabbi is actually, in a way, supplementing for a father, like my father used to say, where I sit is the head of the table. And although he revolted against his own very authoritarian father, in that respect, he was as much a Hasidic like his father was. So one important thing is that it has got nothing to say about power, very little to say about power. And one of the reasons is not only, of course, the democracy. They wouldn't have thought about democracy. And people, of course, today find all kind of justifications, like they find them in the Torah and in the Talmud, that you could debate, etc. It's still an undemocratic procedure. But what is important is that Islam, and this is unique here to Islam, was in a way a victim of its own success. It has created an empire in almost a feat of absence of mind in less than 1 century, and had to organize it practically. Assume that the people who organized it were most of them disciples of the Prophet and disciples of disciples. What would they have known about power? He has controlled Arabia for 10 years and that's all, and then he dies and leaves no message, no legacy, and they have to invent everything. They have to invent a system of taxation, a system of treating minorities, a system of spreading the Arabic language, a system of Islamization, etc. And they invented, perhaps to the best of their ability, assuming with the best of intentions, which is not necessarily the case, of course, always, and they create a reality as there is no scholarly community to debate it. The scholarly community comes second, which in a way the scholarly community, which works in the 8th and 9th century, and you'll see immediately why those faraway times are so important today, accepts a lot of element as fait accompli, as they were created. For example, the whole system of treating minorities was basically a supple system which was goaded towards leading them to Islamize, creating a situation in which they will be respected because they belong, at least they in principle belong to two monotheistic religions, but preferential treatment will be given to Muslims in almost everything, beginning with taxation, access to power, positions of judgeship are all close to non-Muslims, and that gives a lot of people, giving the human motivation to embrace Islam. If you think for a moment, how is it that Babylonian Judaism, which gave us the Babylonian Talmud, disappears almost completely? It knew one golden age later, the Gaonic age, in 8th and 9th century, which is already very heavily influenced by Islam. But then it just disappears. And it's part of Jewish history which we may not be very proud about, but we should admit they just embrace Islam. For most of them, not because they discover that this is a great truth, but because if you want to make it in life, you have to move from village to town. And towns were Muslim. And if you have been a Muslim, you have better access to property, you have better access to wasta, to kind of mediation with the powers, mediation to the powers that be, better access, of course, to rich women to marry, etc., etc. And this is how, little by little, Babylonian Jewry, and later also Syrian Jewry, melted away. A process which will repeat itself later in Spanish Jewry. So we should not be in any self-congratulatory mood. Jews who came into Islam, and of course above all Christians, because those who embraced Islam were above all Christians, contributed a lot to Islam and then assimilated. The result is that you have realities of power about which there is no rules laid down. When the rules will be laid down, and there will be some attempt, later in the Middle Ages, it was already in a situation when the empire was breaking apart. So what do we get as a result? As a result, we get that Islamic law interests lawyers and jurists, is above all applied with the fuzziness which I have described before in a few areas. Number one, personal status, which is very crucial, of course, marriage, divorce, and the like, including as a supplementary value, of course, inheritance, the way property is passed from one generation to another. Rules applying to minorities were laid down on the whole, not always applied by Islamic law, and rules applying to women. Why women? Why minorities? Because Islamic law understood very well there are three major cleavages in society: free man, slave; men, women, Muslim, non-Muslim. Now, there were very intricate laws on slavery. They have been done away with little by little through the 19th century under the impact of Western colonialism. And at the times where the misdeeds of colonialism are very much in our mind, and as you know, Algeria is now demanding of France an official demand of excuse and pardon for the crimes, and there were many crimes. One of the certainly beneficial effects of Western onslaught upon Islam was in the liquidation, little by little, of slavery, which leaves us those two differences, men and non-Muslims. And it's no feat of accident that articles relating to those two issues, whether you can do religious propaganda, limitations on minorities we know. We know very well, for example, that's very interesting at the time, when Switzerland and France and Belgium are debating the question of minaret, that you could not build a church or a synagogue higher than the nearby mosque. Understandably enough, because the landscape of a city is a kind of a visiting card of the city, and they understood it very well. So this was laid down in the law by all schools of law, Sunni or Muslim, with all the varieties. You could embrace Islam. You could not go back from Islam to another religion. And by the way, just between brackets, if you hear quite a lot recently about anti-Coptic agitation in Egypt, you should know that part of the agitation, most of it is a matter of Muslim fanatics, but part is due to the fact that the Coptic Church, being a very conservative church, sticks to the 15th century rules of no divorce. No divorce until the Pope of the Coptic Church allows you this. So many women, Coptic women, finding themselves in an unhappy marriage, have only one way out, which is embracing Islam. And then, of course, hoodlums from the family of the husbands go and kidnap her and put her in a monastery. And then hoodlums on the Muslim side take their revenge, and we know what could happen. And somehow, when the police intervenes, most of the victims are Muslims, are Copts and not Muslims. But it's not always the victim who is the innocent in this variety. You must have known that in exactly a year ago, in October, a year and 1 month ago, there was a huge demonstration of Copts who moved by buses from the south to Cairo and made a huge demonstration over a matter related to kidnapping of those women seeking divorce, and made them in huge numbers and before the buildings of radio and television, which tells you how much Egypt has changed. Not only Muslims consider themselves to be citizens all of a sudden, but even those despised cockroaches who come out of the woodwork, Copts. It's not me who says this. It's Muslim who wrote this in editorials in the press. And they go to Cairo, 400 miles, and demonstrate in the next best place, apart from, of course, from Tahrir a square. The world is not what we know it's about. So those basic limitations, the fuzziness of the law, the fact that ulama on the whole are subservient to power and trying to justify whatever deed. It's not because they are not courageous, but because they are afraid of anarchy. They have a very Hobbesian view, understandably enough, because Islam has known during its first and golden century 2 civil wars. So avoiding them is the best. Well, the role of intellectual is very limited. Even though today they are trying perhaps to introduce Al-Azhar University into the game, I don't believe they'll succeed. The Al-Azhar people are too timorous to do this. 3, that Islamic law has very little to say about matters of constitution, but has a lot to say about matters of attitudes towards minorities, rules governing them, and status of women, defined very simply. A woman is half a man, which means that if you need 2 witnesses, you'll need 4 women as witness, even in cases as complicated as rape, which makes it, of course, a joke, usually in such a situation. Those are the questions which will be harassed. And above all, because this is, and I'm going back to where I began, because this is a giraffe, because this is fuzzy, human invention and human interpretations rule supreme. and there will be as many views as there will be Muslims in any given state. So we are looking for trouble, but this is at least a trouble which may lead to better times. Thank you.